Good morning and welcome to the Iowa Ideas panel, the session on changing landscape of college athletics in the higher education track. Certainly want to acknowledge and thank our presenting sponsor, ITC Midwest, for their support of this conference this year and past years as well. A few reminders to our attendees before we get started. This session and any other session that you attend today and tomorrow is being recorded and closed captioning access is available. You are also welcome to submit any questions you have through the Q&A function, and that will get relayed to me. I'm John Steppe. I'm the Hawkeye football reporter for the Gazette, and I'll be the moderator this morning for a discussion that I'm really excited for with a fantastic panel. Three people with great expertise, three different perspectives on what's happening right now. First of all, Joshua Gordon. Josh is a senior instructor of sports business and law at the University of Oregon's Warsaw Sports Business Center. He also is the founder and senior practitioner of the Sports Conflict Institute. He has experience as an arbitrator and mediator for the Court of Arbitration for Sport in Switzerland, for FIFA, and for the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. Josh, do you have any time to sleep with all those things?
I like to stay busy. I think any former student athlete will be the same way when they're in their careers too.
Well, speaking of former student athletes, got Joe Parker, who has been the Deputy Director of Athletics for Strategic Initiatives and the COO of University of Iowa Athletics since July. Joe previously spent nearly 9 years as the athletic director at Colorado State and has previous stops at Texas, Washington State, Oklahoma, Michigan, and Texas Tech. He brings a strong background in revenue generation, including a lucrative naming rights deal for CSU's football stadium and an ambitious capital campaign at his alma mater, Michigan. Joe, are you trying to cross every conference you can off your list here?
Uh, I've been in many, but no, that's not been a goal of mine necessarily.
And then we got Brian Harden, who's the athletic director at Drake, has been there since late 2017 and has overseen teams with 12 regular season conference titles, 13 conference tournament titles, and 34 NCAA championships appearances. Brian, a Des Moines native, came to Drake from our alma mater, Marquette, where he was deputy AD. I guess that means with that Marquette education, the smartest Iowa Ideas panelist ever. I say in a very unbiased manner. But aside from that, he also has experience at Ball State, Notre Dame, the Chicago Bears, and Loyola Chicago. So, first of all, for everybody, and I'll start this one for Josh, we've seen a lot of changes in college athletics over the last 5 years, 10 years, whether it be the transfer portal, NIL, or the upcoming direct player compensation or revenue sharing with players. How much change do you think we'll continue to see, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, kind of down the road?
Yeah, 10 years sounds like 100 years right now. I would say 5 years, you're still going to see a lot of change. You see from a weekly standpoint, the legal landscape's changing really, really fast. And then we don't really know all the unintended consequences once you change a system like that. And so I think we're going to see a lot of sorting out and market impact on what that does to the entire student athlete experience. But at the same time, as much as all this changes happen, if we really step back a little bit, a lot's really the same too. When you're in the day to day on a campus, the student athlete experience is pretty much still at the core the same. You're balancing a lot of really challenging classes along with the demands of your sport. You're building all these life skills that's going to prepare you for career readiness. When we take student athletes out to career trips, everyone talks about their hard work, their perseverance, their resilience, their leadership, their followership. All those attributes are the same, and the stats, as we all know, probably aren't going to change at all. I don't think we're creating more professional sports opportunities. So at the end of the day, I do think as much will change, fundamentally, this idea that outside the GI Bill, this remains one of the greatest opportunity generators for a number of folks. That remains the same as long as we continue to cherish that part of it too.
Joe or Brian?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Josh said. The last 3 years has been just a sea change for many of us. I've spent 30 years in college sports, maybe a little bit longer when you tack on my time as a student athlete, and this has been more rapid change and just the uncertainty too. That's been the challenge, I think, for most of us, is that we're just living in so much ambiguity. It's hard to kind of exactly plan what would be appropriate and how you want to build your strategies. But the one thing that I've been really hopeful for, and I know hope is not a strategy, is that we do reach a steady state, some level of stability that we can begin to kind of plan again and know that we've got a 3 or 5 year plan in place that's not going to see any significant change to it. But much like Josh, I still, with all the change, I still see all the value that college sports brings to the individual participants and certainly the people that engage around it from a fan perspective as well.
Yeah, I think that the change is will continue to happen at a rapid pace. I'll be curious to see what happens around student athlete employment. I think the Title IX lawsuits that come from revenue sharing will be interesting to follow, kind of see what does that do to our industry. I'm curious about conference makeup and where conferences continue to adjust. Will we see conferences merge? What will major college football look like? At what point do those top brands of those Power Two conferences decide they want to stop sharing revenue equally with other members of their league that have lesser brands? There's already a pulling away of the Big Ten and the SEC from the Big 12 and ACC. Well, at some point, will the Big Ten and Big 12 powers kind of pull away from their own league, or want to kind of change the model for what it is? It only seems like it's a matter of time before Ohio State figures that they want to stop sharing equally with Purdue and Northwestern. So that all brings about change, and and then where I'm sitting in terms of kind of being a mid-major and someone that's a basketball school, is the concern I have is looking out 5-10 years down the road, is once all the wells start to dry up from where college football schools can pull money from, at what point will they turn their attention to March Madness and try to change what that model looks like? So I think there's an incredible amount of change that could be on the horizon.
I'll start with Joe on this next one. What do you see as kind of the greatest benefit of the changes that we've already seen over the last 5 or so years?
Yeah, there's been obviously in the last 10 to 15 years, a lot of money has kind of flown through the system with the changes in the TV contracts. So I think just the modernization of the model where student athletes can figure out ways to earn compensation above and beyond their scholarship is a really positive change. I was reluctant to see it. Reluctant to agree with it, but as I've seen the benefits that's occurring, I think in some cases it can be a generational shift in a student athlete's life and the life of their family. So I think it's good from that perspective, and I think if we do make it to the revenue share model with approvals of the settlement, I think that'll just, really reinforce the stability of that model, because there is so much fluctuation and still, I think, a lot of hyperbole out there about what, the world of collectives is delivering to the student athlete experience. So I think anything that creates stability, anything that puts the work in the hands of the professionals can be a positive things for the student athlete.
Brian, what do you think on this?
I think just the power shift we've seen from being in where the departments and coaches are, to student athletes having much more power, much more opportunities now. They have, some may argue that it has overcorrected itself, and we may need to come back a little bit. But from the NIL pieces to just other items, that we've seen changes in terms of the insurance coverage after graduation, the ability to go back and get your degree. I think there have been a number of pieces that just kind of got swept up and lost because of the NIL and the transfer portal piece that has really kind of stolen a lot of the headlines. But it's It's never been a better time to be a student athlete. And so the benefits of being a student athlete are terrific, and that's probably been long overdue. So happy for what today's athlete is able to benefit from.
And then Josh.
Yeah, to Brian's point, I mean the experience that they get now is probably the high point of ever being a student athlete, and it may never get better, frankly. I mean, you really have all the support that you could have imagined, and all those stories that we were so disappointed about 10 years ago of folks scrambling for food on campuses and really feeling very exploited. That's not what I'm seeing anymore. And I was as vocal as anyone that that was holistically unfair at that point. It's been hard sometimes to listen to congressional hearings and hear that it's taking a little while for some of our public narrative to catch up to how rapidly that support system has evolved. And just about any campus across D1 now is really doing right by their student athletes in a profoundly different way than it was before. So I think that opportunity isn't just an opportunity to name, but it really is a genuine opportunity. With that said, with it comes a lot of distractions. So, there's a lot of conversations with student athletes to help them recognize that most of that NIL money is not going to be generational wealth. It's going to be a starter to your career. And all those numbers, as we talked about before, remain the same. That you're really using this educational launch pad and the relationships you build through your sport and the assumptions about who you are as an individual. So, again, trying to have that groundedness. I do think for this little bit, there's going to be moments where folks blow through these resources that they've been given, and then we'll see sad stories on the other end of it, and then hopefully we'll normalize where we start to get a bit more of a foundation of what it means, how do you use this, and create the opportunity that everyone really wants out of that too.
For Brian, what has NIL looked like at Drake, and has it been helpful to be in, at least within the Missouri Valley, a relatively larger market with Des Moines?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess are you talking NIL like true NIL, or are you talking about like collective NIL?
Let's go all of the above.
Okay. So I would say true NIL, like what it was intended to be, I think is a good thing because um, Iowa is a college sports state. In Des Moines is the third largest market in our conference, with Nashville and Chicago being larger. But those are pro sports markets that have a lot of competition for attention and dollar. That's not really the case in Des Moines. So we've had nice success on the true NIL front of some of our top athletes being able to develop partnerships with car dealerships and fast food chains and uh, other local restaurants and businesses to capitalize on some connection to Drake, and it helps in some cases when we've had some local athletes who've been able to kind of really try to capitalize on their name, image, and likeness. And then I think on the collective front, it's helped. I mean, we quickly developed the most successful collective in our league. And I think that's because we've got alumni that saw an opportunity for Drake to punch above its weight class. And this is a chance for us to kind of maybe do things that we hadn't been able to do before. So that certainly helped. And we have some local businesses that want to jump in and support that, and some influential alumni in the area. So when we're not really in competition with some other folks here, and we have a market the size of Des Moines compared to maybe some of the other college towns in our league, it certainly has put us in a nice spot.
Do you have any of the Drake NIL ray gun shirts yet?
Oh yeah, no, I try to support all of our athletes. So whether it's from our men's, women's basketball teams, the Tucker DeVries ones are on sale right now for some reason. But the Zoe Mahoney when she had the flip throw last year with the throw in for our women's soccer teams with our Mahoney Magic, and so that's been a great partnership that we were able to benefit with Ray Gun to create those opportunities for our kids.
For Joe and then for Brian, kind of on a scale of 1 to 10, how much, when you're talking with your coaches, kind of how much has NIL been a factor as they recruit?
I'd say the conversations vary. Some days it's probably approaching, the 8, 9, and 10 mark threshold, and other days it seems less intensive for them. But I think kind of a consistent number would be a seven. And then it also depends a little bit upon sport. I think there's been some really acute sport specific impacts with NIL. So I think men's basketball is the one that felt it first and probably the full force just because of the size of the rosters, are much smaller. So, NIL investments, particularly through collectives, can be more impactful. A football roster being, 125 or 30, it's just less opportunity to have, focused investment there. But I've been proud of the coaches here at Iowa. As I've begun to learn the place, they've relied still heaviest on the traditional student athlete experience, the culture that they can build within the team. And then they've chosen to make investments, I think, in student athletes that have developed here. So it's been more of a retention tool, I think, that's been used as opposed to, let's go out and try and find talent that hasn't been developed here. So I think that's been a healthy thing for Iowa and will continue to be, the right approach.
I'd say on a scale of 1 to 10, men's basketball probably is, around a 9, 8, 9 that you would expect. Women's basketball for us, maybe more like a 4. And then all of our other sports on a scale of 1 to 10 probably is a 0. I mean, it's just doesn't really register. I mean, our student athletes are like the living embodiment of that old NCAA commercial where our athletes go pro in something other than sports. I mean, they come in here, they're true student athletes. They understand kind of what the opportunity is here to compete at a Division I level, to compete for conference championships in a number of our sports. We got a few of them that will compete at regional and national levels. But by and large, I mean, they're making the decision to come to Drake to further their athletic career, but really kind of invest in a terrific academic experience in a really kind of in a city that is a hidden gem here, not just in our state, but in the Midwest in our country. So, yeah, I'd say we've got one program that is certainly is a part of a lot of conversations. Another one that hit or miss. It's and then nobody else that really is asking too much about it.
And then specifically for Josh, what are kind of putting your sports business hat on here? What are the factors that you see most influencing an athlete's potential NIL marketability?
Yeah, it goes back to this. Well, if we're going to talk about real NIL, right? Let's start there and we can go back to the other. Real NIL is hard. And I think a lot of our student athletes are learning that you don't just turn on one of your social media platforms and then brands come running at you as fast as they can to pour money on you because they have a real ROI that they need to demonstrate. And what you're then trying to figure out as a student athlete is who are you? What do you represent? What are your values? Who connects with you? Who wants to engage with you? Once you kind of get that sorted out, then you can figure out brands that also fit in that ecosystem. But none of that is fast or easy. And I think that's a big part of it. You can't just, if you're doing it for the money, it shows and it becomes really transactional. And the brands actually aren't particularly looking for that on that side of it. It's also its own job. So, you do the math, you got Kara hours, that's a pretty good chunk of time. And then by and large, you take your number of credit hours, multiply it by 3 or 4 per week. So you're talking 48 to 60 hours per week in the classroom and around the classroom. Now you're talking about a job and a half. And then the advice many of our student athletes get if they're trying to generate substantial revenue coming out of real NIL is doing an ungodly amount of posting if you're going social media. So put content out early on, put out 50 posts a day on TikTok, right? I don't know how you have time for it. I mean, you talked about how do I have time for things? That's a whole different level of time management at that point. And so that part of it, there are folks breaking through, but it's not an overnight thing. A lot of them started doing it in high school, building a following. They have a really keen sense of who they are. They know that they're passionate about, animal rescue. And then there's a little ecosystem around that and it plays really well. Other folks are, you can't be everything. You can't have 5 different energy drinks that you're going for and expect that to cut through much noise. And the other thing about it is there's a decision to make of whether or not it's particularly fun to live online, because with it comes a whole lot of student athlete welfare challenges. I don't know if Joe and Brian are seeing this, but we've certainly been seeing this across the Big Ten. A lot of harassment of student athletes who put themselves out there in social media, because you also have this confluence of gambling going on around everything too at the same time. So we have a bit of a perfect storm where we've incentivized folks to go out online, and then we've also put the crosshairs on them because of gambling and other ways to try and upset and distract, right? With that said, it is a great learning in all of that. And maybe even just to figure out whether or not that's how you want to live your life and that's where you want to play. There are lots of other NIL too that's more bread and butter, old school, running camps and doing those kind of things that I actually think have been really rewarding for student athletes who have engaged in that. On the other side of it, it's we are trending towards an employment model, at least for some subcategories. The revenue share is interesting because it's still not categorized as employment, right? The way it's framed. And probably the best way to reconcile is to think of it as brand ambassadorship. Because when you look at a big football program, it serves a pretty valuable role for each of our universities as brand ambassadors. When I go speak at conferences around the world, a lot of the reason people recognize the Oregon O is not because of my research or my colleagues' research. It's because of what happened on the football field. And then we get the opportunities to do what we do on the academic side. So I think there is some fairness in compensating brand ambassadorship. I don't know that we're actually paying for football. I think in some ways, we are paying for that uptick in admissions and for all of the other reputational considerations too.
And then kind of I'll start with Josh on this one and then go to Joe and then to Brian. What do you think NIL is going to look like when we start to get to the revenue sharing with athletes, and kind of how does that change NIL?
I know what the hope is. The hope is to really allow a great free market for real NIL and to really clamp down and call the other what it is, right? Some form of compensation. Compensation for what? We can debate that. It's pretty open. It'll probably be challenged legally of what we're categorizing all of that for a while. But I do think, it will remain challenging to figure out what is the market value for every NIL deal and was that something that you can enforce around it. But there will be significant efforts. Part of this settlement, if it goes through, is to bring some sanity back into that marketplace and to bring transparency. I mean, obviously, you saw what happened at UNLV and a lot of misunderstanding about whether or not there was promises made, and that's all stuff that our industry, and at least at the professional level, can handle well. You have good contracts, you have a clear marketplace, you have established value for different things. So I do think the idea of bringing some sanity, some consumer protection, so to speak, back into it would be very, very helpful. And then on the competitive equity side of it, if you're going to have something akin to a cap, then you need to make sure those buckets of revenue are clean and clear. And if folks are trying to misuse a different bucket, that there's an enforcement mechanism. And all that is where folks are going to be rolling up their sleeves from now and until the next year and probably keep reconsidering, because I don't think you can get 100% right from the get-go.
Yeah, I agree with everything Josh just said. I think the absolute intent of the settlement and the position of the leagues that have been responsive has been to get greater control over that collective NIL marketplace, which isn't grounded in any level of rational thinking as it relates to how a student athlete's brand might be able to promote or help a business or an entity gain exposure for their product or service. So it'll be a complicated dance, I think, to get there. But I think the rev share gives us that opportunity. If everyone is able to budget in the $22 million to rev share, then that's a lot of money to work with across all your rosters and make decisions about that brand ambassadorship that Josh was speaking of. There'll be inherent value to certain student athletes in that space based on the profile that they have and the role that they play on campus in their sport. But I think there's been so much in my opinion, hyperbole around the collective NIL space that, some transparency, some daylight will be really, really beneficial, I think, for all the players in the market, whether it be the students themselves, the people that are trying to represent students, the parents of those students, the coaching staffs, certainly the administrators, to have some transparency, clarity, and real understanding of what the market is will be very, very helpful to all the players involved and help them make really informed decisions finally.
Yeah, I think that, for as long as recruiting has been in place, that schools have always been trying to identify ways to make their program, their team distinct compared to somebody else out there. And there's been different segments of an arms race that has occurred in college athletics. Most recently in the last 20 years probably would be the type of facilities boom we've seen and kind of what schools have put into creating and building these new facilities, all to kind of catch the attention of prospective student athletes. I think that arms race shifts from facilities over into pay above and beyond what the 22 million will be from the shared revenue piece. I just think that there will still be a space for the collective. We've already heard Tennessee's AD said they're going to spend 30 million next year. Well, that 8 million is coming from somewhere. And so I think there will always be that race to try to one up your rival. And I think that the NIL collective or whatever that kind of looks like, if it comes in house or if there's still a place for it to be a third party outside, will still exist because there will always be schools who are trying to find a way to get one up on their big rival to land that prize recruit. So I think that it will still exist, and it'll be kind of that cherry on top of what schools will be able to do once the house settlement gets settled or gets approved.
For Joe specifically, at kind of Power Four schools and more specifically Big Ten schools, do you think you're going to see schools fully fund that 22 million? How close do you think they'll get?
Yeah, that's hard to understand that right now. I mean, I've said this to many of our staff members and had conversations with probably even you, John, about it. But the good news for a place like Iowa is that we generate $150 million a year. The bad news is that we spend $150 million a year. So when you try and figure out how you're going to fill a new bucket, which, the permissible amount is going to be somewhere north of 20 million, how do you do that? So we've been going through a lot of thinking on, reallocation of existing spend. I've termed it as legacy spending. How much can we peel back from things that we thought were once important in our budget that may not be delivering the same return, to put that dollar into the revenue share bucket. And then obviously there's going to be a great deal of effort to try and figure out how we can expand our revenue streams to fill it. So I don't know, with 18 schools in the Big Ten now and a lot of variability in our schedules or our budgeting models, will everyone get there? I'm not sure. Will everyone work as hard as they possibly can to do so? Absolutely.
And then for Brian, what's that going to look like in terms of for a Missouri Valley school?
In terms of how they approach that $22 million.
Yeah, and how close you can probably get to that figure.
I think we'll probably be within 22 million of it. I mean, it's it's not the same. I mean, I grew up a Hawkeye fan, so I love to see what the Hawks are doing. And Joe mentioned a $150 million budget for Iowa athletics. That's $20 million more than the entire budget for Drake University. Not Drake Athletics, but the entire university. And so that 22 million is more than our entire athletics budget. So no one in our league is going to be anywhere close to that. And in fact, I'm not sure kind of what that will even look like. I'm not even sure how many of our schools are going to choose to opt in. As candidly, I mean, we're having conversations about sitting out the first year or so just to see if there are Title IX lawsuits. Let's not embroil ourselves in that. Let's kind of sit out, watch from the distance, have our collective ramp up their efforts and still be able to kind of do what we need to in our space. And let kind of, the dust settle somewhere else. the A4 schools have to go into it. They're required to. It's permissive legislation for us. So I think that we'll see some of our schools in our league will opt in. I know there are some schools who've already said they're not going to opt in. Eventually we'll get to the point that I would imagine that we will, once some more clarity kind of should comes in the form of how we can do things in a legally defensible way with our student athletes. We may allow some others to kind of go through that mess initially before we kind of jump into the fray. But even then, yeah, we're not really in competition with some of those A2, A4 schools for those football or basketball recruits. So we kind of look to see what our peers are looking like. And so I've been in more conversation with folks, bottom half Big East, top half Atlantic 10, Mountain West, kind of what that looks like to get a sense of where they're going to be. And then we'll make decisions accordingly based on some of that information.
Perfect segue to my question for Josh about kind of how vulnerable is the NCAA to kind of future litigation and future legal challenges to this kind of post-house reality that we're currently sitting in.
Yeah, look, they remain vulnerable from my perspective. What you've done with the House settlement is you've taken some of the biggest threats and you've mitigated a bit, right? Because some of the folks who really felt like they were left out of this marketplace now have a significant stake in the new system that's being built out. But with that said, there's no congressional antitrust exemption. We don't have a collective bargaining agreement to provide you that non-statutory antitrust exemption. So to the extent that the NCAA puts its toes in the water on anything that constrains this marketplace, they'll pretty quickly face lawsuits, is my prediction. To the extent that they don't, then the NCAA has a bit of an existential crisis to figure out, well, what do we do? Now, you should do health and safety standards really well. You should do research really well. You should do championships really well. If you're doing those things well, then your existence becomes a little more secure. If you're not doing those things well, then you can imagine with the type of need for revenue generation and everything else that private equity and other forces will start to put pressure, even non legal, but just market pressures to try to reinvent. So by and large, it's probably going to remain a bit tumultuous for a bit here to see before we get that full stability. And they're in the back burner is all these hopes and dreams for congressional action. You've had some very smart folks put out their ideas of non-employment status, but allow for collective bargaining so you can codify some of the student athlete voice into the system and create the stability that you have in our professional models. There's some good arguments for that. But again, I think until you that really gets you out of that antitrust crosshair, it's going to be potentially a little vulnerable. But this was obviously more of that full-on existential bankruptcy moment. And to sidestep that, I think is an important and celebratory moment if you care about this larger ecosystem around student athlete opportunities.
Now, following up off that, what's your level of confidence as we keep on hearing people say, hey, need congressional action? What's your level of confidence in terms of that actually happening?
I wouldn't put a lot of my eggs in that basket personally, but we're in the election home stretch here, and depending on which way that goes, you'll have different potential willingness to engage in Congress, right? Right now, obviously, nothing's going to happen during this or the lame duck season. That seems pretty clear. And then the question becomes, you know, are there enough of bipartisan support for it? And that really comes down to local support. So depending on what the impacts look like across campuses, across the footprints, then you may have a willingness to lean in and be a bit protectionist to try and stabilize this whole thing. Because if you have folks that are really being left out of what's been a really important part of their communities around college sports, and then that might put some pressure on it to create a bit more stability than what can be done through a class action suit. So I don't think it's high on the list, but there's been some very interesting bills out there. There's been some open floor discussion. Those are worth at least paying attention to try and get a sense of where the appetite is. And there's been some bipartisanship, but I don't think we're anywhere close to having a story that comes across your news desk where we're going to be talking about this.
And then got a really good audience question. I'll start this one off with Joe, and then if Brian and Josh have insights as well, that's fantastic. What are your thoughts on the short-term and long-term impact of the NCAA approval of the scholarship increases?
Um, yeah, I mean, we've already run some exercises here that when we apply the scholarship, or rather the roster caps, we're gonna be a smaller department. Um, there'll be opportunities lost on our campus for student athletes that were probably in that walk-on cohort that will no longer be a part of our rosters. So we're already having conversations with coaches about that. It's, as you know, there's not a feathering in or gradual step towards that. It's going to be an immediate, between the end of this academic year and the beginning of next. We'll have to make those decisions. So our coaches will probably start conversations with student athletes that might be impacted sometime early in calendar year of 2025. But then there will be a positive side of that, for us to after that exercise, for us to be compliant with Title IX on our campus, we're going to have to increase the scholarship count on our women's side, and that will be a good thing for those students that are on that roster that may not have been touched by financial aid. They'll be touched by financial aid, and that'll have a really strong impact on them and their families. So that's a good thing to consider. But it is a brave new world, and we're trying to figure it out and navigate it. And we want to do it with compassion and understanding. And if I know our coaches, like I've known coaches in other places, they'll feel compelled to help those students that may be impacted find a comfortable landing spot somewhere else outside of Iowa.
Yeah, I think that the Josh kind of touched on the impact of just college athletic scholarships and outside the GI Bill, how successful it's been, and I think we'll see some other families that will benefit from the new roster limits, that they now will have a son or daughter will leave school with less college debt, which will be a great thing. I think unfortunately the other side of it, when roster caps, we'll see some individuals lose their opportunities to be part of that Division I program at that specific school because their position as a walk-on may be eliminated. I think for private schools that are tuition dependent, that when you reduce someone who is paying full freight to go there and simultaneously potentially increasing scholarship to someone else, that can throw off your net tuition revenue. It can throw off your discount rate at your university, so it can have a much larger impact on the campus. Those dollars have to come from somewhere. So I think that's something that, at least talking to colleagues of mine at other private schools, that were kind of mindful of what that could look like. I'll be curious also to see just how many schools go up to those limits. It's you don't have to be at that up to the all the way up to that limit there. So what will that look like? But I said those are a few of the things that I'm just kind of monitoring. There will be some really tremendous outcomes from this, and there will be some unfortunate conversations, and that will occur on campuses, and hopefully those athletes will then find a home for them at another school where they can complete their degree and go on and make a positive contribution to some community.
Yeah, Joe and Brian are absolutely correct that it's going to have impact for sure. And there's been a bit of a misconception where a lot of student athletes, when I talked to them and they heard about this, roster limits and uncapped scholarships, that they all felt like they're heading to a world where everyone gets full rides. And that's just not going to be the reality from what I hear from anyone. Um, Obviously, if you could do really well in revenue generation, maybe over time you start to increase what you can invest around that side of it. But there's going to be a degree of austerity in this, even though that may not be the most satisfying approach. Um, the other side of this will be interesting is, will this impact the coaching markets over time? And probably not immediately. No one's going to tear up their contracts, but over time, as you cycle through new coaches, do you start a little lower to create some protection of some of that revenue to reinvest back in the folks who are on the field? But this entire endeavor, there's going to be a loss of some opportunities for sure, as Joe and Brian were sharing. but hopefully the quality of the experience for those who are in that remains really, really high.
And then I'll start this one with Josh and then go to Joe and then to Brian. What do you think this will do, particularly with opportunities and kind of number of teams in terms of a lot of the non-revenue, non-football, non-basketball sports?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think we know well enough yet. I do think the intent from most universities at this point is to protect the number of teams, but perhaps trim on the edges and reduce some of the opportunities. Some of these rosters have admittedly become a bit inflated over the years because there wasn't a pressure to do much about it. And if you want to look at the optimistic side of it, there is some benefit in having slightly smaller rosters in terms of those who are on feeling more connected to what the team is doing, having greater opportunities to actually see playing time and to be a bit more recognizable within that ecosystem. But you saw during the pandemic a bit of a dry run for when resources dry up, and some schools flirting with the idea of cutting programs. Think of, pretty publicly Stanford played around there. They did bring all those programs back, but there have been trimming from what I understand. And I think that's a reasonable analogy to think about where we're headed now, where you've got some limitation on where you're going to have resources across your department because you need to invest in those that bring in revenue as well.
Yeah. For us, we are comfortable supporting 22 varsity programs. There's been no discussion about, going there to try and manage our expense model in a different way. Through and coming out of COVID, the university did make a decision to eliminate ultimately 3 sports. So we went from 25 to 22, but leadership, that is Beth Getz and the president, are committed to remaining at 22. So I think as we kind of build what our future looks like, it'll be with the intent of maintaining those 22 varsity programs.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Josh is saying. We'll see different situations at different schools. Like Joe mentioned, that it's similar here at Drake. We've got 18 sports, and uh, we've had zero discussion about reduction of sports. I think you could see reduction or elimination of scholarships in some programs. I think that schools will maybe, if they haven't already, begin to tier some of their programs and protect those that are revenue producing. And then I think you'll see some adjustments made to maybe second tier team sports or some of the individual sports or country club type sports, in terms of keeping opportunities consistent, but maybe reducing investment in athletic aid in those spaces. So I think that's probably a likely outcome. We've already kind of heard that from a variety of schools and athletic directors kind of hinting at that. So that probably won't come as a huge surprise to anybody who's kind of following the situation right now.
And then I'll start with Brian and then go to Joe and then to Josh. So reverse order on this one. We've obviously seen an explosion of interest in women's basketball, especially in this state, but also across the country. What do you see as kind of the next? It's hard to duplicate that explosion in interest, but the next areas where you could see a lot of growth and fan interest.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think our state should take great pride in the explosion of women's basketball because of Caitlin Clark. I mean, it's just growing up here in West Des Moines, she went to my rival high school, and amazing what she was able to do, and then certainly what she did at Iowa was incredible, and then took over the WNBA, and so I think there's still room to grow in women's basketball. I don't think we're quite to the mountaintop just yet. Volleyball has been a sport that has been on the rise in pockets of the country. You saw Nebraska have over 90,000 fans go to a match there. We've seen, what other schools around the country are able to do with that sport. I think we've got great volleyball in the upper part of the Midwest and some really dynamic programs around here. We certainly have seen a significant increase over the past couple of years in following our volleyball programs. I think that's a sport that continues to gain popularity, and we see it more on television. And then one I would say is that's not an NCAA sport, but I think will gain popularity over the next 4 years. It's going to be flag football, especially on the women's side. I think as we head into the LA Olympics in 28, I think that we'll see that it's already flag football on the women's side around the world is quite popular. I spent some time down in Panama this summer with our football team. and they're very proud of their women's flag, national flag football team. And so I think that program that has the backing of the NFL here in our country. So I would think that over the next 4 years, as we build towards LA 28, that flag football will continue to grow in popularity.
Yeah, it's already been said, what happened here for women's basketball, was remarkable. Happy to report that, it's seems to have some staying power. We're sold out on a season basis for our women's basketball program, so I don't think it was just associated with Caitlin and the one personality that was on the team and her profile, but we have women's wrestling here. I think that's a sport that has an opportunity. It's an emerging sport within NCAA. We're the only autonomous four program that sponsors it. But certainly the interest that people have in the sport generally, I think, will help propel that forward. So we're excited to see how that grows and develop. And agree with Brian. Volleyball is a women's sport that just isn't well known on the men's side at the collegiate level. Some of the schools in the Big Ten sponsor it, and some of the schools on the West Coast. But I think for most, when they think volleyball, they think women's volleyball, and I think that's a sport that's going to continue to grow and gain interest.
Yeah, they're spot on with volleyball. I mean, that sport is just made for immediately stepping in, having a great experience as a fan. It's quick, it's fast, it's easy to understand, and the level of play is really, really good right now across the collegiate landscape. So that one's kind of a no-brainer. Beyond that, it's going to be a nice time to see where folks can invest in both looking at the rules to make it as presentable as volleyball is, right? It really that wasn't always the case. When you couldn't score on defense, the games felt long. Those were long matches. Now that you can score any time, it sped the whole thing up. So I do think looking across sports and trying to figure out how do we make it more consumer friendly if you want to generate revenue and you want to generate interest in those sports, it can't just be about the student athlete experience. It also has to be a pretty entertaining product. And so I think that's some of it. It's really a bit unclear what those sports will be. Brian's right to mention flag football because of what's happening with LA. There's a lot of momentum there as well. But we'll see. I think it'll surprise us. I don't think we fully know where that'll be, but each school is going to be in the business of trying to generate revenue across anywhere they can. So it does create some healthy experimentation going on too.
For Brian specifically, 3 NCAA tournament appearances for men's basketball in the last 4 years. What's been the key to kind of sustaining men's basketball success as a mid-major, and how do you sustain that when then your coach gets a outstanding opportunity at a autonomous for Power Four conference?
Yeah, so I'd say both our men's and women's programs are having unprecedented success simultaneously right now. I mean, we became the first school in the Missouri Valley Conference history to win both the men's and women's basketball conference tournaments in consecutive years this past year. And so I think the secret to both of their success has been the leadership of both programs and how they have committed themselves to transformational relationships with their athletes, not transactional relationships. And what I mean by that is making sure that the athletes understand that the coaches care about them more as people first and as athletes second. We haven't seen, knock on wood, we haven't seen a lot of folks transfer out here, and we've had some really good players that have been here at Drake, and they've had opportunities. Folks have called them to kind of see if they'd be interested in going somewhere else. But I think what we've been able to kind of build within the culture of our department, within our locker rooms, has been allowed us to kind of keep our teams intact. I think our coaches, Darren did an amazing job of pouring himself into the guys. We had some great guys who were here for 4, 5, 6 years in some cases, that really kind of helped get this program to a spot that it hasn't been in 50 years. And now, and Allison does the exact same thing with her program. We've got some really dynamic players, and I think that piece there is because they love playing for each other. They love being here at Drake. Our fans take a genuine interest in them as people, not just as jersey numbers. And so I think that all matters for us to maintain that now, because obviously Allison's still here and is doing a great job. Darren left for West Virginia. so Ben McCollum comes in and, just kind of picks up where Darren left off in terms of how he's trying to connect with the athletes. And that was a huge part of the interview process when I was talking to a variety of coaches. It's just, okay, what are you doing to connect with today's athletes? Because at our level, it can't just be about transactions. The athletes can't feel that the coach is only trying to help them so that he gets his next contract or is able to bounce out to another school. Because if it's all about transactions, there's always going to be a school out there who can offer somebody more financially in this new NIL era than maybe what we can do here, Drake. So it's got to be something we got to find a connection point that is greater than just a transaction, and that's our understanding, getting that connection point to a coach, to a campus, to a community, and that's where I think we've had success in kind of hitting in all three of those areas.
And then another great audience question. I'll start with Joe and then go to Josh and then to Brian on this one. Wondering how each person feels that the Alston monies will be utilized in this new landscape while we have all these other things that also are, costing money, and how will that be utilized, and is that even going to exist now?
Yeah, I think when our hands were tied as we defined a scholarship, it originally started as Zoom board, books, tuition fees, then we layered in, I think it was cost of attendance first, and then we had the Alston money that we put in place. So all of those things were efforts to, effectively grow the level of compensation kind of or support that you're providing to student athletes. So I don't know how necessary some of those things will be in the rev share model. We've already talked about, should we consider that as recent legacy spending and reallocate that into the revenue share bucket? Is it necessary? Now, the one piece that we've diagnosed too is that, internationals, that might be an opportunity for them with the Alston dollars to still, enhance what we can do for them through, beyond a traditional scholarship. So everything's kind of been on the table, but I would say the prevailing thought that I've heard most from our campus and others is that Alston may not be a necessary consideration in the future.
Yeah, I'll give a brief answer, which is it's really would be helpful to have some tax professionals around this question in particular, because different types of compensation under the umbrella of things that can be done around helping support student athletes have different tax consequences, both for the institution and for the individual. So I do think at different levels, those things will sort themselves out over time. But Alston benefits are an educational benefit. They've got a lot of tax benefit in that way. So they may have some stickiness in terms of that because it has a uniqueness, and as Joe said, can be offered to international student athletes without putting their visas at risk or any of those kind of things. So I think TBD, a lot of this stuff's going to be experimentation because campuses have the ability to make decisions now that they've never had the ability. So now you're going to really see where the talent lies in athletic departments and campuses broadly.
Yeah, our counsel back to us is that's as long as the Alston piece continues to be, educational or academic type achievement awards, it can maintain its non-taxable status, and so that there will be a value to that. So I'd imagine that we would continue doing it, not knowing what any type of shared revenue could look like from a taxation standpoint. There could be a piece there, so I think you actually could probably actually maybe extend out what the Alston Award piece is. I think the cap of that it comes off as part of this House settlement. So you have to just kind of figure out what is that level that you're comfortable going and it's defensible to maintain the tax benefit for the student athlete. But I think that that's certainly a piece that we've looked into.
And then I'll start with Josh and then go to Joe and then to Brian. If you could change one thing about college athletics right now, what would it be?
Yeah, I do think it's the instability at the moment. I think it's really challenging for folks to make good decisions when there's so many moving parts with conference realignment, with the rules themselves are going to be rapidly evolving over this next year to try and be responsive to hopefully the settlement going through and then trying to figure out what that looks like. So many rumors around NIL on social media trying to puff up a market that may not be quite as accurate as it seems. I think if we could just get to a little stability and a lot more transparency, everyone would benefit because then you can start to make decisions, be a bit strategic and not reactionary. So I think for everyone's sanity, I say student athletes, staff alike are probably at risk of burnout if we don't get some stability. So hoping to find our way to a new norm, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, don't really have much to offer because that's exactly what I would have said. So thank you, Josh, for providing a very good answer for probably all of us. But yeah, stability and transparency would be really, really helpful to helping us all plan forward.
Yeah, I would echo those sentiments. The other thing that I would throw out there, and I'll be in the minority on this feeling of this panel here, I'm guessing, but I wish we could find a way that some of the new college football playoff money could go to actually pay the House settlement back pay pieces. I mean, there's $1.3 billion a year that's going to be coming in annually to some schools, and the House settlement back pay is grossly unfair to the majority of Division I membership. We're going to end up be paying significantly more to former Power Five football and men's basketball student athletes and it's coming from mid majors and low majors. And there is a significant pot of money from the college football playoff that I understand the NCAA doesn't oversee that. But if I could change one thing, I'd love to find some way for those dollars, that $7.8 billion over a 6-year period, to go and help cover that almost $8 billion back pay for the House settlement.
And then I'll go Joe, Brian, Josh on this one. Do you think is the biggest misconception or anything that you wish fans knew or better understood about college athletics right now?
Yeah, I think the biggest disappointment to me through all of this, last 3 to 5 years is that people have really lost sight of what we do every day is in the space of human development. We bring 18-year-olds to campus, in some cases providing the first time ever for a first generation student to integrate into the college experience, and once they're a part of it, their life is forever transformed. And I think that has been just almost totally ignored by media partners who have really just talked about the egregious fact that that there's not enough money going to the students that are generating it. And I get that piece too, but still, I think every one of us that's got involved because we view ourselves first and foremost on some level as an educator, coaches included, and that's something that just does not get underscored enough.
Yeah, I think that what drives me crazy kind of get lost is that all the headlines of all the changes that are happening in college athletics, the rules that are being adjusted are really going to impact like the 0.001% of college athletes. There's about 500,000 college athletes, and we're kind of changing everything for a very select few. It also, drives me crazy. People were to kind of look into how the House settlement was determined. I mean, it was shocking to listen to Steve Berman's interview with Gabe Feldman a week or so back and hear that the negotiations that led to the terms of the House settlement were actually done with the commissioners of the Power Five conferences like that, and to have the other 27 conferences not represented, but then told, oh, by the way, you have to pay this bill now, even though the issues in play are athletes that weren't in those other 27 conferences. So now you've got a school like Drake that has to pay $3 million over the next 10 years in back pay, essentially to former Power Five football players. That basically, it's going to come out that our annual payment of $300,000 is going to pay 2 to 3 former Power Five football players annually for the next 10 years. You've got schools in the Big East, John, your alma mater, other schools in the Big East and the Atlantic 10 that don't even have football. They're having to fork over these dollars. It's like how this was arranged and is just beyond shady, and how we're able to what we're looking at now and how it's going to impact so many moving forward and those schools who are most impacted are the ones that don't have the ability to get out there and generate the revenue that those schools who do have the ability are the ones that should be taking on their lion's share of payment back to their own student athletes. So that part, like if people kind of understood, I did a radio interview here in Des Moines a couple weeks ago and kind of walked them through this, and they couldn't believe what I was telling them. Like, no, this this is, what's going to happen. Here's how it was created. And I think anybody, when you hear those facts, like, God, that's hardly seems fair. Um, that we're moving into a better space, and we needed the settlement to occur, but the terms of it, it should not have happened the way that it did.
I go back to recentering, and it remains in the Constitution, the primacy of academics here. And last night I was at our SAC meeting. We had nearly 200 student athletes show up just to meet each other, continue to do career development for themselves. The sizzle reels kind of do a disservice, right? They're really exciting. They show the, fancy uniforms, facilities, everything else out that a lot of fans seem to associate with this. But in reality, what you have is deep relationship building. You have really great educational moments, and we're building great people who go out into the world and do impactful things. And that part, I think, has gotten lost in the last couple of years in the conversation of just how much that really is the core of what's going on and remains what's going on. It's hard to hear all of the professional conversation from fans when they forget about that part of it. And one of my least favorite things is if I'm in the stands at one of our sporting events and I hear just harassment coming from fans to 18 to 22-year-olds. All I want to do is show up at their job on Monday and just verbally pick them apart at what they're doing. And, they're twice their age usually who are watching. So just to remember, have a little empathy out there that these are really young folk who are learning, who happen to be exceptionally talented in their sport. But that doesn't mean they're any more prepared for that kind of environment than any of the rest of us would be either.
Well, thank you all to our fantastic panelists. We are over time, and I might be verbally picked apart if I drag this on any longer, since there's another panel that needs to start. But thanks to our attendees for tuning in as well, and we hope to see you at some more panels.